Welcome back to the pond. I thought today I'd do a video on upgrades and updates that I've made to the pond since completing it around 5-6 months ago. So far everything's been working an absolute dream in terms of keeping the parameters good, keeping the water clarity good, and also it just being really low maintenance. I mean, I've hardly had to do anything to it. But saying that, as everyone who has a pond knows, it's never 100% complete, and there's always little bits that you can change and add and upgrade to make your life easier or to increase the well-being of the fish. So probably the biggest change so far is the addition of an air pump. Much to some people's disbelief or shock or horror, there was no air going into this pond in terms of additional air that I was putting in. All the oxygen was really just coming from surface agitation from the waterfall. I've built similar ponds before without having to add any air to it, but the waterfalls are a lot longer. There's a lot more force going down the waterfalls, and there is a bit more of a drop on the waterfalls, and the ponds aren't quite as big. So for those reasons, I've probably been getting away with it before now. The koi weren't, really gasping for air or anything like that, but having spoken to a few people on some group chats that I'm in, some of them are extremely good at growing their koi. I mean, one person in particular regularly gets toe size, so that's a year old, up to 60 centimeters, which is mind blowing for me. And since I've started to up the feed a lot to really start to grow the koi, I figured I'd start taking some of their advice. And one of them is obviously adding oxygen into the pond. So after adding an electrical supply down the very bottom of the garden, I plugged in a 70 litre per minute air pump, and it was feeding an air bar that I've put directly under the waterfall. Now, the logic for this is, with my pond, I'm very conscious of it trying to look as natural as possible. So my logic here was, if I have the air bar underneath the waterfall, the extra oxygen and air bubbles that are being created at that part of the pond will look like it's just coming from the waterfall, and it will look pretty natural. It also gave a really good pushing effect on the surface of the water. So now the surface of the water pushes down the far end of the pond, i.e. this end, where the skimmer is, a lot quicker than it was before, which is only going to be a good thing for clearing surface debris, muck and leaves. So that's also another positive thing. I decided to go one step further and have the pump feeding two air lines, and one of them goes round the side of the pond and basically pretty much under where I'm sitting under the decking. The logic for this was simply just to get more air in the pond. The 70 litre per minute air pump was probably not being used to its full effect because it was only going to one air bar that probably wasn't man enough to have 70 litres per minute going through it. So I've simply split it, and I've put one under here, quite simply again because you can't really see it because it's under the decking. The way I split it was I used basically a T adapter, and it's got a valve on each separate bit, so that way I can turn up or turn down the flow, so I can basically get the flow how I want it to each air stone that I've got. If I was to just let all the air run to here, it will all come through here and hardly any will go through the air bar at the top of the pond by the waterfall. So I've put a valve in just so I can adjust the flow rate to make them somewhat even. To hide the air hose, I simply hid it underneath the pebbles in between the fence and the pond. So that's that done. Got one air pump that is feeding the air bar under there and an air stone. You can't really see it. It's coming from just under the decking. I know obviously it would be a lot more effective if the air is kind of in two places in the middle, but this is kind of where I'm going to be battling for aesthetics versus performance. So we shall see how that goes. Another thing I've changed, which I won't spend too much time on, is the food. So somehow I've completely fluked my way to getting my hands on some Nutrimare 360 that isn't actually available in the UK open market, I guess you'd call it. that's not the point that I'm trying to make, although so far that food has been absolutely perfect and really good results so far, but it's only a few weeks in. The main thing with the food that I've changed is I've started using some sinking pellets. So the bottom of my pond is covered with pebbles, and I've got a under gravel suction grid. I mean, it's not gravel, it's pebbles, but an under pebble suction grid that then feeds the filter. So I've had great success with these designs over the years. None of them have seemed to clog up or create big dead spots or anything like that. But my logic with the sinking food was, if I can find some sinking food that will land on top of the pellets and the koi will eat it before it has time to work its way through the pebbles, through the slits in the pipe, and then into the filter. Hopefully, seeing that the koi have very powerful suckers, I don't really know what you'd call it, whilst they're kind of sifting through the pebbles trying to find the food, hopefully they will agitate some of the muck, some of the biofilm, some of the algae that's sitting on the pebble. This was my logic, and so far it has worked absolutely wonderfully. The most important finding so far is that I'm not seeing any pellets in the drum filter, in the waste discharge part of the drum filter, or at the end of the waste discharge. So they're not getting sucked up into the suction grid, which is good. And the other thing, which is the reason why I wanted to trial this in the first place, was they have cleaned the pebbles wonderfully. I've been putting the sinking food in the same part of the pond so I can fully, gauge if some pebbles are cleaner than other parts of the pond and stuff like that. And I'll show you on a video, but where I've been putting the sinking pellets, there's no algae or anything on the pebbles at all. I'm not saying that algae is a bad thing, not at all, but if they're managing to sift through it enough to release a lot of the algae, whatever you call it, they're probably doing the same with small bits of muck and waste and stuff like that as well. So I'm really, really happy I thought of this idea, and I'm definitely going to continue to do it, but over all areas of the pond. So another important upgrade that I made to the pond was adding a separate 55-watt UVclarifier unit. There is currently a 20-watt amalgam UV inside the drum. I'm pretty sure that probably was enough, but it was the beginning of spring. There was kind of a slight yellowy, almost greeny tinge to the water. So I put in an extra UV clarifier. It did fix the issue. It made the yellowy greenish tinge disappear completely. But at the same time, the pond had only been running 4 or 5 months at the time. It was its first spring, which means that it's likely that the 20-watt amalgam UV inside the drum probably is enough. I will be switching off the 55-watt UV clarifier that I bought in spring, just to see if it is actually necessary. The particular UV clarifier I bought was actually sold as a steriliser. I'll get onto that later. So this is sold as a 55-watt steriliser. Now, 55-watt steriliser, minimum flow rate, they say, is 8,000. And they say maximum, I want to say around 16,000. Can't remember exactly, maybe 14,000. So I'm a bit confused how all other 55-watt sterilisers say that you shouldn't be going any more than 5,000-6,000 litres an hour through it. But then this one, the minimum, they say, is 8. To me, I could be completely wrong, but to me, you're probably pumping the water. What are you doing? Probably pumping the water through too quick to achieve sterilisation levels. Now, I could be completely wrong. But the unique selling point for it, which is why I bought it, was the fact that it has 4 inlets stroke outlets. Because I already have a UV inside the drum, I added this UV after the pump, so in between the pump and the waterfall, simply because the extra 2 outlets that aren't in use means that if I undo them and turn off the pump, all the water from the bog filter will drain back down the pipes and back through the UV and then out of the outlets that I've undone into the bottom of the filter pit where the sump pump picks up the water and discharges it to a drain. So by adding the UV unit, I've added a way that I can somewhat backflush the bog filter. It's not obviously the best way of cleaning it, but if there ever is any build up, or I do just want to give it a backflush every now and again, that is an option that I can do. Like I say, it's not the best, it's not going to be the most effective, but it will help keep on top of things. I can also use this method to clean the biological filter. At the moment, it's still all static because I haven't really found a need to make it aerated yet because my water parameters are always so good. So how I'd clean the biofilter would be to put an air stone in there, which I have done before, put air through it so it all agitates, keep the pump on and undo the UV filter. So when all the agitated, dirty water goes through the pump, it then falls out the bottom of the UV into the filter pit, into the sump pump, which then takes it to a drain. Like I've said about 10 times already, I know these aren't the most effective ways of cleaning it. I could come up with other solutions that are more effective, but they will take a lot of work and I personally don't really think they're necessary. I mean, I've got a drum filter before it. Yeah, there will still be a bit of build up, but like I say, if I just have somewhat effective ways of cleaning it out, that would be more than enough. Another thing I've been doing is playing around with the flow on my VariFlow pump. So a VariFlow pump basically allows you to control the flow rate or the strength of the pump going through it. Now, if you look online, there is so much different information out there on how strong your pump should be comparatively to the size of your pond, which is basically the turnover rate. Some people will say, oh, you need to turn over your pond water through the filter roughly once every 2 hours. Some say 1 hour, some say every half an hour. Now, there's so much conflicting information on this, but everyone is right and everyone is kind of wrong at the same time. Now, there are so many variables which will dictate on what is right for your pond. I mean, there's what fish you're keeping, the size of the fish, the quantity of the fish, what food you're feeding, how much food you're feeding, the type of filtration that's used, how often you're cleaning your filtration, are you doing water changes, how often are you doing water changes, there's sunlight, how much is your pond in sunlight throughout the day. There are so many variables, which means that you can't just read something online and know that exactly that number is right for my pond. So what I believe the best thing to do is getting a VariFlow pump, starting somewhere in the middle of the range of all this information, checking your parameters regularly, maybe once a week, maybe more often if it's a new pond, judging the clarity of the water as well, obviously if that's a big thing for you, and then just increasing or decreasing the speed of the pump as the weeks go on, so you can then find what is optimal for your pond, because every pond is so different. So I started the pond with a 30,000 litre VariFlow pump. My pond is around 11,000 litres and it was on around 50% when I started. I've since upped it to around 70% strength. I believe this means it's around 20,000 litres an hour, which is a turnover rate of just under twice an hour. For me at the moment, with the amount I'm feeding, to get the best clarity, it seems around 70% on my VariFlow pump is about right. Another good thing about the VariFlow pump is that when you make it more or less powerful, it will also tell you how many watts it's using. So that's always a good thing to consider with electricity bills and stuff like that. So there's a bit of a saying in the pond community that a pond's never finished, because there's always, you know, little upgrades and updates and little bits that you can tinker with to make it a bit more effective in some ways. And now that I've had my pond for, well, complete for 5-6 months, it's been up for almost a year now, I'm really starting to understand that there's going to be several things that I'm going to be doing over the next few months and few years, little upgrades to the pond. I mean, for example, a very little one is just going to be adding another 50 litres of K1 into my biofilter. I'm also going to be building a pond cover for the pond for over winter. It's not because I'm going to be trying to keep it at 20 degrees over winter so I can keep growing them. It's not going to be like that at all. It's just for when the water would get that cold. Hopefully the covers will just increase that temperature by just 1 or 2 degrees, just to prevent them from being quite as unhappy as they were. And also similar with my dad's pond. I mean, that's a bit different, but it's 8, 9 years old now. It was our first ever pond build that we did. It's still functional, it's still very good, but knowing what I know now, there'd be a lot of things that I'd have done differently. So we will be redoing the whole lot. We're going to be putting the fish in a temporary holding vat. We're going to be taking out the old liner, relining the whole lot, new filtration system, new waterfall / bog area, absolutely everything. So I will be documenting that, doing videos on it. That's likely to be early next year. So if content like that interests you, maybe consider subscribing, and I will see you next time.